The idea of a greater Israel based on the Promised Land concept has shaped Jewish identity, politics, and religious imagination for thousands of years. Rooted in biblical scripture and nurtured through centuries of diaspora, the concept refers to a land divinely promised by God to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what does this promise truly mean? Is it a spiritual metaphor or a physical geography that Jews are destined to reclaim? And in modern times, does the state of Israel aim to control all of this so-called promised land? The foundation of the promised land lies in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Genesis. God's covenant with Abraham, the patriarch of Judaism, is first mentioned in Genesis. Here, God tells Abraham to leave his country and promises to give his descendants a land flowing with milk and honey. This promise is repeated and expanded in later chapters. Genesis is especially detailed. To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. These boundaries encompass a massive area far beyond the borders of today's Israel. Biblical commentators and theologians have long debated the exact dimensions of this territory. If taken literally, the land would stretch from parts of modern-day Egypt through Israel and the Palestinian territories into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and parts of Iraq. This vast region is referred to in Hebrew as Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, the greater land of Israel. While some rabbis argue that these boundaries were metaphorical or conditional, others see them as a concrete inheritance awaiting fulfillment. The idea of regaining this divine inheritance was kept alive among the Jewish diaspora. After the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and expelled many Jews from Jerusalem, the hope of returning to Zion became a core theme in Jewish prayers and national longing. The phrase "next year in Jerusalem" symbolized not only a return to the city itself, but also a return to a divine homeland promised by God. However, this religious longing was spiritual rather than political for most of Jewish history. It wasn't until the late 19th century that the dream of a physical homeland began taking shape through the Zionist movement. Founded by Theodor Herzl and others, Zionism was a secular nationalist ideology that sought to establish a Jewish homeland in the historic land of Israel. While early Zionists were aware of the biblical promised land, their focus was more practical, building a safe refuge for Jews, especially in the face of rising anti-Semitism in Europe. When the State of Israel was declared in 1948, its borders were based not on biblical lines but on the United Nations partition plan. However, religious Zionists saw the establishment of the state as the first step toward the fulfillment of God's promise. This view intensified after the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel captured East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. Many Jewish settlers and political leaders saw this military victory as divinely ordained and a signal that the land promised to Abraham was within reach. From this point onward, the religious narrative began merging with political goals. Settlements in the West Bank, which many Jews called Judea and Samaria, the ancient biblical names, grew rapidly. Religious nationalist movements encouraged Jews to redeem the land by living in it, often backed by Israeli governments through infrastructure support. This deepened the conflict with Palestinians, who also claimed this land as their homeland. One of the key scriptures fueling this ideological expansion is Deuteronomy. Every place where you set your foot will be yours. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon and from the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is cited by some religious groups as justification for establishing Israeli sovereignty over larger areas. However, not all Israelis or Jews interpret it this way. Secular and liberal Jews often see these verses as symbolic or historical rather than a mandate for modern expansion. In fact, the idea of Greater Israel remains controversial within Israeli society. While far-right political parties and settler movements advocate for annexing the entire West Bank and beyond, centrist and leftist parties support a two-state solution that limits Israel's borders. Leaders such as Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Olmert pursued peace processes that involved territorial compromise, often citing the need for coexistence over biblical entitlement. Outside of Israel, the concept of the Promised Land has taken on political weight in Christian Zionist circles, particularly among evangelical Christians in the United States. Believing in the literal truth of the Bible, many evangelicals support Israel's right to the biblical land, seeing it as a fulfillment of prophecy. This alliance has had real political consequences, especially during the Trump administration, which moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. However, international law does not recognize biblical texts as a legitimate basis for national borders. The United Nations, the European Union, and most of the global community consider Israeli settlements in the West Bank illegal under international law. Resolutions such as UN Security Council Resolution 242 call for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in 1967 based on the principle of land for peace. This puts Israel's religious nationalist vision at odds with global diplomacy. The most pressing example of this tension lies in the occupied Palestinian territories. While some Israelis believe they are fulfilling divine destiny by settling the West Bank, Palestinians view it as a continued occupation of their land. This contradiction is at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Peace efforts have repeatedly failed, in part because of conflicting narratives, one religious, the other nationalist, both claiming the same land. There's also the question of demography. If Israel were to annex all of the West Bank and other territories mentioned in the Bible, it would have to govern millions of Palestinians. This would threaten the Jewish majority and democratic character of the state. Some far-right voices suggest alternatives, such as transferring populations, but such ideas are widely condemned as unethical and illegal. Contemporary Israeli governments have not openly declared a desire to expand to all biblical lands. Even under right-wing leadership, such as Benjamin Netanyahu's administration, the official focus has been on security, normalization with Arab states, and maintaining the status quo. However, elements within the government, including members of religious Zionist parties, do support broader territorial ambitions. In 2020, plans to annex parts of the West Bank were discussed but suspended after US and Arab state interventions. At the same time, peace efforts have stagnated and settlement activity continues. Some analysts argue that while full annexation is unlikely in the short term, a slow and de facto absorption of Palestine is occurring. This raises fears among Palestinians and human rights groups that Israel's long-term goal may indeed reflect biblical boundaries, even if not publicly stated. Interestingly, many Jewish scholars and religious authorities argue that the Promised Land concept should be seen through a spiritual lens. According to this view, the covenant with God is not about territorial conquest, but ethical living. The land is conditional on justice, righteousness, and moral behavior. God warns in Leviticus, "If you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations before you." This suggests that ethical conduct is more important than geography. In conclusion, while the idea of the Promised Land is central to Jewish theology and identity, its modern interpretation is complex. There is no single answer to the question, does Israel want to get all Promised Lands? For some religious nationalist groups, the answer is yes. They see modern Israel as the beginning of divine fulfillment. For others, especially secular Jews, the biblical boundaries are symbolic and not meant to define modern politics. The official stance of the Israeli state avoids direct reference to biblical promises, instead focusing on pragmatic security and diplomacy. The question of the Promised Land will likely continue to shape Israeli politics and Middle Eastern geopolitics for years to come. It sits at the intersection of religion, nationalism, history, and modern international law. Understanding it requires not only reading ancient scriptures, but also observing how they are interpreted in today's political realities.
Yes, the Greater Israel concept is highly controversial. However, the recent developments in Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Iran make this concept meaningful. Let's see what will happen.